Do you think that the financing system of Basque Country and Navarra should be removed?
Oh, totally. I don't know if you saw my X post this morning on July 18th. It needs to be abolished, destroyed, exterminated. And once we have finished with that, we are going to bring a Catholic bishop who is going to do an exorcism of every single code book that ever had any memory of that system and throw holy water. And then we are going to go to Wikipedia and eliminate all references in Wikipedia that system ever existed, and go to every textbook and eliminate every reference in the textbook. Am I clear? What Stalin did to Trotsky memory in the Soviet Union is little in comparison with what I want to do with the cupo.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me here.
So I'm looking forward to talk about your new book. Here it is.
Yes.
And of course, it's been making quite a stir in the last couple of weeks in Spain because of the recent legal adjustments that are trying to be made in the Catalan region.
Yep.
We'll come to that. And I want to start off very broad. In something you mentioned about asking the question, what did Schumpeter understand about the concept of states that political pundits tend to don't understand?
Okay. So the point that we highlight at the beginning of the book, which is recalling a very famous talk that Joseph Schumpeter gave right after World War I in Austria, is that a modern state is basically a fiscal state. By that, he meant that the fiscal structure of a state determines all the other political, economic structures of the state. And therefore, if you change the fiscal structure of a state, you are changing the state in itself. And the examples that we give in the book are very straightforward, and two that come to mind is, well, the United States. The United States is born from a fiscal dispute. So the British Empire was organized around the idea that the colonies in North America had their own responsibility for taxation, for fiscal policy. And then in some moment, the government in London decides that should not be the case, that they want to move to a different system. And that initiates a constitutional conflict that ends up with independence of the United States. But many people forget that the constitution that we have now in the United States is actually the second constitution that the United States had. In the 1787 constitution, there was a previous one, the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. And what happened with that constitution is that it set up a fiscal system that was not sustainable. And it's very clear by around 1786, early 1787, that the system is not working. And that's why James Madison convinces many other people to call for the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia to create a complete different fiscal system, and with it, a complete different federal system. And the interesting thing is, if you actually read the pamphlets and the articles of the time, it was very clear to everyone involved that we were talking here about fiscal systems. So that's the first example that we have in mind. And the second example is the French Revolution. The French Revolution comes because Louis XVI needs to call the État Général because the French fiscal system was in complete bankruptcy and he wants to change it. And that unleashes a series of forces that leads to the French Revolution. So at the very core of the origin of this modernity, you have American Revolution and the French Revolution. Both revolutions are fundamentally about fiscal structures. So when you are talking about fiscal structures, it's not that boring class you took in public finance in your senior where they were telling you about debt loss taxation. Is actually the very essence of a modern state. So taxation is the state and the state is taxation.
Okay, so we're going to be talking a lot about Catalan, Basque and also, but Catalan in particular. And of course, coming from the outside, people tend to think the Catalan tendency towards separation is a very recent phenomenon. As you highlight in the book, it's not. Given that the sentiment of Catalan separatism far predates the modern state of Spain, is there a future where you think this sentiment goes away?
Okay, so there is a low frequency movement that is happening right now in Catalonia, which is the enormous demographic change. Okay, and I have made this point many times. Right now, around only 55% of births in Catalonia are born from a mother that was born, actually not even Catalan, that was born in Spain. okay? That basically tells you that only 45%, perhaps even a little bit less, of mothers that were born in Spain speak Catalan at home. At this moment, I will say that less than 28% of kids born in Catalonia, perhaps even less, will speak Catalan at home. And that basically means that as we fast forward over the next 40, 50 years, the use of Catalan as a language will suffer a lot. And usually these type of nationalist movements are very directly linked with the language. Not always. You have the case of Ireland as maybe as an exception. But in that sense, my reading of the situation is that Catalan nationalism will be much less prevalent in 2060 than it will be today. Again, all this depends on a lot of demographic factors. And of course, forecasting the future is difficult.
Of course. When in 2017, when there was the illegal referendum in Catalan, there was, following that situation where the Supreme Court wanted to give some massive fines to people involved in using public money to push forward the referendum. One of them was a very well-known economist. And at the time, many international economists, Nobel laureates, with some letter where they supported the economist that was proposed to use public funds to also promote separatism. Why do you think that a lot of international econ profession tend to be a bit more lenient when it comes to separatism in Catalan, but not, let's say, revolt in DC?
Yeah, I think that there is a combination of factors. Academics tend to always look sympathetically to what looks like that the underdog, poor economist who is trying to fight for freedom or whatever you want to call it, and he's been fined by the legal authorities to be forced to pay some money. So that always looks good. You stop randomly an academic in any university and you tell a story like that without entering into many details, and people will always be sympathetic. The second point, which I think is more important, is he was a very well-known academic, very well-respected. I don't have anything negative to say about his academic accomplishments, and that make him look very favorable towards the rest of the profession. But I was my experience at the time. Several people asked me, and when I outlined the legal structure of the case, everyone was like, wow, this is not exactly what I thought it was. So let me give you a very concrete example. As you probably know, in the United States, organizing a referendum of independence for a state is unconstitutional. The Supreme Court has decided that. So imagine that the secretary, let's say Pennsylvania, decides to sign a piece of paper saying that he's going to use money from the government budget, from the state, from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania budget to pay for that referendum and to organize the steps for that referendum. And in addition to it, he has a report from the legal office of his Secretary of the Treasury telling him that this is illegal. And yet you still sign it. How will you react if I tell you that case? Has this person incurred any type of legal liability? Of course it has. And when I explain it in that way, a lot of people will, I didn't know it. Some people reply, oh, he does microeconomics, he doesn't really know about the law. And I said, no, but remember, the legal counsel or the senior legal counselor of his department sit with him and explain to him that what he was going to do was illegal. And yet he signed. So what do you want me to say? At the end of the day, he's not going to pay that money back. But I think that we should not confuse one thing with the other.
Was there any, in your view, economic logic behind the autonomous community design following transition and new constitution in 1978?
Yes, okay. You need to think about the history of Spain and the economic history of Spain more concretely in a little bit of a wider framework. Spain doesn't do a very good job during the 19th century. So Spain doesn't transition successfully to what many political scientists have called the modern state or the modern liberal state. It's a process of construction of a modern state that remains uncompleted up to today, in fact. And one of the consequences of that incomplete transition is that Spain has only weakened industrial revolution. Now, modern historiography tends to be a little bit more positive than the traditional view that was always very negative, and I agree with that modern view. But nonetheless, at the end of the day, think about the big picture. in the process of a construction of a modern state and a modern economy during the 19th century, Spain got a B- or a C+. Now, in particular, that incomplete construction of the state means that in the late 1870s, Spain has or undertakes something that is called, I'm going to say it first in Spanish and then I will translate, el giro proteccionista de la restauración, which basically means this is the Bourbonic restoration after the First Republic. The Bourbon family comes back to be the new kings of Spain again, Alfonso XII, Alfonso XII. And in particular, the party in the government at that moment, the Conservative Party with Cánovas del Castillo as prime minister, is a very strong defender of autarky, very high protectionism, and a lot of state intervention. Maybe now this is a little bit easier to understand after the new administration in the United States, but people often forget that the conservatives have traditionally been the party of tariffs, of protection, and state government intervention. It was the liberals who were against that. But to make a long story short, from around 1878 to around 1959, Spain embarks in a process of autarky, import substitution, and very state, and a lot of government intervention. That changes dramatically in 1959 with the Plan de Estabilización, the stabilization plan, where basically Spain opens to international trade, makes peseta convertible, the currency that we use at that time. And first and foremost, the consequence is that for around 17 years, Spain grows very fast. So when you want to think about why Spain is a modern country, why you go to Madrid, you go to Barcelona, it looks a lot like many other European cities. Those are the big years where Spain goes from being a very poor and underdeveloped country to be a modern economy.
And those are during the Franco period, just to make that point clear.
But remember, it's from 59. The first Franco is against it. This is the second Franco. And I can tell you exactly why the Franco regime completely changes its economic policy in 1959. But to make a long story short, that process of growth, think about it as very standard neoclassical catch-up. Is also based on a lot of very energy-intensive model of growth, comes to an end around 1973, 1975. First of all, because the oil shocks means that energy is much more expensive. Spain doesn't produce any oil or any natural gas of any importance. And just because I was saying before, just the pure process of convergence kind of reaches to its end. So the Spanish economy is in a very difficult situation. And in particular, you need to reorganize the public finances. And for that, you need a complete new framework of government. And that's a little bit the economic background behind the Spanish Constitution of 1978.
Actually, before we go on that point, why did Franco too change the policy so quickly? I heard some people claim all the technocrats really got into the brain of Franco, but what was it in your view?
No, I agree with the conventional historiographical view. Franco never believed in the market. And he was really forced into that in 1959. So the persons to keep in mind over here were basically Alberto Ullastres and Mariano Navarro Rubio. So the situation, and to some extent, maybe a little bit less, Laureano López Rodó. So let me give you basically what happens and a little bit of historical background. Contrary to what many people believe, Franco regime was not monolithic. Okay, it was really a coalition between different groups. Is what political scientists sometimes have called limited pluralism. And what they mean by that is, of course, you are not a democracy. I don't want to confuse any listener into believing that this was a democracy, but it's not a monolithic structure like the monolithic structure of the Communist Party of China today, for instance. And there were different groups within that coalition of government, which in Spain we refer to them as familias, families. So one very important family, for instance, were the fascists, the falangistas. They were also called sometimes the blues, los azules, because their shirt of the Spanish Fascist Party is a blue shirt. And these guys were going to think about Mussolini, maybe Hitler, except that in Spain anti-Semitism was never a big deal because, of course, at that time the Jewish population in Spain was very small. And these guys believe in a standard fascist economic, industrial policy, etc. The main representative was a guy called Schwantes, and very strong defense of workers' rights. People tend to forget that fascists were very much into the defense of workers' rights in a very peculiar way. But anyway, and then you had the army. The army was another family. And then you have the monarchists, the old monarchists, who believe in a very traditional view of the monarchy. They came in two flavors, the ones who defend what is the current branch of the monarchy of the dynasty in Spain, Felipe, not Felipe, but his grandfather, Juan de Borbón, And they were the flavor that defended what was called the Carlista branch, which was a branch that broke off in the early 19th century. And then there was a group, as you were saying, that were called the Technocrats. So who were the Technocrats? The Technocrats were basically people who, as you say, many of them were linked with Opus Dei, Catholic. I'm forgetting another group, the propagandistas, but don't worry about those. And basically, these guys had a lot of background in education. They tended to be either professors at the university or very top civil servants. Something for people who are from outside of Spain perhaps is sometimes difficult to understand is that the examination to get into the top civil service are extremely competitive, and really they are the top. They are the top of the crop, the cream of the cream at the university. It's a little bit different from the United States or other countries. Anyway, so you have all these type of people who are very prepared, much more professional, and much better knowledge of the international developments, and they think that Spain needs to develop and needs to grow. Now, they were not Democrats in any meaningful sense of the word, but on the other hand, they thought that a very old-style dictatorship didn't look that good in the context of 1959. And what they wanted maybe is to move towards a little bit of a soft authoritarian regime, something like that. Now, they are in minority in the government, and they cannot really impose their views, but they have two enormous advantages. The first enormous advantage is that they can get things done. Okay? So Franco realizes the first technocrat that comes to power is Llano López Rodó, who is basically running the day-to-day of the Spanish civil service. I don't know how many listeners may remember a wonderful British TV series called Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister.
I know it very well.
Yes. Well, so then they may remember Sir Humphrey Appleby, like the top seven. Laureano López Rodó was Sir Humphrey Appleby. He has the advantage that he gets things done. Okay, so when Franco or his kind of second in command, Carrero Blanco, says, I want to do this, I want to prepare this project, I want to accomplish this thing, Laureano López Rodó shows up 1 month later and says, look, this is draft legislation, this is the organization that we need. And both Franco and Carrero Blanco start to realize if we want to survive and have an effective government with high capability, these guys are very good. The second thing that these guys have in their favor is that both the United States and all the international organizations like the IMF and the World Bank, that indirectly depend on the United States as well, really support them. The United States, of course, wants a reliable ally in the Cold War against the Soviet Union, and it was a prosperous ally, and it wants an ally that is not going to fall to the Soviet subversion. And having a crazy, semi-fascist structure with an underdeveloped economy, that doesn't look very good. So the United States and the IMF really like López Rodó, Navarro Rubio, and Ullastres, because these are the guys that can get things done, that can get Spain modernized, and that helps in the big context of the Cold War. And of course, that means that not only you have the pressure of the United States, but you also have the money of the loans that the IMF or the World Bank can give. And this makes a huge difference. And the third fundamental issue is that Spain has run out of foreign currency. We are in a situation where this import substitution scheme, this import substitution model of economic growth has completely run out of steam, and there is no money. Navarro Rubio wrote memoirs that are very interesting, and I always recommend to those who want to read them. You probably need to get them in some type of library because it's impossible to get. But Navarro Rubio explains how there is a meeting of the cabinet, and Franco is against this plan de estabilización. Because I remember Franco never liked the plan de estabilización. He did it against his best judgment. And the meeting ends, and Franco gets out, and Navarro Rubio follows him. And I don't know how many readers know this or how many listeners know this. It's a little bit of insight, but Franco is very short, and he has this very high-pitched voice. And Navarro Rubio was very tall, very big guy, and very deep voice. Navarro Rubio follows Franco and says, mi general, my general. In Spain, you don't call sir to the military officers, okay? That's only in the American movies. You need to call them mi general. Says, mi general, we are running really out of foreign currency. This is serious. We need to do something about this. And Franco, which understood about economics, as I understand, about the production of mussels in the Black Sea, but what about the crop of oranges? Because, of course, even at the time, the export of oranges from Valencia and Murcia were a big part of the exports of Spain. But even in 1959, it was not that much. Navarro Rubio replies right away, but what if there is a frost and we lose the crop? So we don't have that inflow of foreign currency. And basically, Franco replies, do whatever you want, but don't get me involved into it. Which me is the ultimate example of a state with a complete lack of capability when the dictator that is running this country says, do whatever you want, but don't get me involved. So this is basically, I think, Franco recognizing that he doesn't really have any real alternative. He never liked it. And even until the end of his life, even if he had to rely a lot on the technocrats, he always had a little bit of a love-hate relationship with them, precisely because on one hand, he admired that they could get things done, but on the other hand, he was very suspicious of what their ultimate goal was with respect to his regime.
Okay, so there's one thing that you highlight and stress about in the book that I was very surprised by, which was that in practical terms, the decentralization of a Spanish state is even more so fiscally than the US. Could you explain how this is possible?
Yes, so this is very interesting. Okay, so when the Constitution is being drafted, basically the idea is we have very different views. There are different parties. There is a committee. They put together a committee to draft the Constitution. And the problem over there is that there is many different views. The different drafters of the Constitution decide to write a constitutional text that is extremely ambiguous. Okay? So the Spanish Constitution allows both a tremendously centralized state structure and an extremely decentralized tax structure, and the same with all the other type of rules. That was probably a good idea. That was a good idea because all the previous constitutions that Spain had, so Spain had a constitution in 1812, in 1834, the Estatuto Real, 1837, 1845, 1854, 1868, 1873, 1879, and 1931. All these constitutions had always been constitutions of one political party. There had never been an effort to draft a constitution where different political parties with different programs could all use that constitution. So the Constitution of 1978, in comparison, is a constitution that allows for a high degree of indeterminacy in how we are going to structure the country. It turns out that for a number of reasons of political economy that we try to describe in the book, briefly, if I may say, the book is 93,000 words, but it could have perfectly been 200,000. But for a number of reasons, basically we end up in a situation where we really push the Constitution to its max in terms of decentralization. So at this moment, I will say that Catalonia or some other regions have certainly more fiscal autonomy than most states in the United States. Now, and more power. At the same time, it's a system that is very obscure and poorly designed and does not provide the right incentives. So the good thing about the US is that you have the Federal Revenue Service, and that generates the taxes for the federal government, and then you have the state taxes. Now, the system is not as clearly delineated as some people claim because there is a lot of transfers from the federal government to the states. What you have in Spain, in Catalonia, is that there is roughly only one fiscal agency, only one revenue service, and then the money that comes from that revenue service is allocated between the central government and the region. This is different, though, from the system in the Basque Country and Navarra. The system of Basque Country and Navarra is truly the system of a confederacy. So, if you live in the Basque Country or Navarra, you don't pay Spanish income taxes. This is something that most people will find shocking, but that's the fact. Okay, so if you are in Vizcaya, there is a specific Vizcayan income tax. Now, people need to be very careful about this. This is not like in the US, if I live in California, I pay my federal income tax and my California income tax. This will be a system where if you live in California, there is no federal tax for you. So California will be getting all the money, absolutely all the taxes in its territory, taxes on income, on profits, corporate taxes, VAT, absolutely everything, and then takes a little bit of that money and transfer to the central government. And that's, in some sense, the system that the US, as I was mentioning before, had under the Articles of Confederation. So the fiscal system in Delaware was completely independent of all the other 12 states or United States, and then Delaware will give a little bit of money to the Continental Congress. And that's the system that you have right now in the Basque Country and Navarra. And what happens is that, of course, this system gives enormous power to those two regions, and it basically means that they are not contributing that much to the common pool to pay for services like national defense, public debt, etc. And Catalan nationalists have said, me too. I also want to be in that situation. So they want to move from a situation where they already have an incredible amount of power. And as I mentioned, as we mentioned, and I think we document very well in the book, for instance, certainly much more self-government that states in the United States, they will basically be a confederate state within a confederation. And that's what we think will be a terrible outcome. And we don't think it's a good idea. And that's why we wrote a whole book about that.
I'm not sure if I want to go down this particular side quest rabbit hole, but it's something you mentioned about the Constitution that I hear often people tend to think the 1812 La Paper Constitution was a lot more broad in terms of it all encompassing different viewpoints, like different hemispheres in Spain, Hispanic world, and so on, than any other later constitution technically in Spain.
That's true. The 1812 Constitution was relatively open to different views of the world, and the problem was a little bit utopian. It was a constitution done in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars, and I think that constitution fails not as much as being a very narrow-minded constitution, as I would say was on the side of the right, for instance, the 1834 Constitution, or on the side of the left, the 1931 Constitution, but I think it was just utopian in the way it was structured. That was not the constitution for a country in 1812. So, for instance, the idea of the system of representation that it set up, I don't think it will have ever worked in practice. Now, having said that, it is true that if, for instance, after the independence of the Americas, we will have had, let's say, in 1834 or 1837, a constitution inspired by the principles of the Constitution of 1812, but with a much more realistic framework, I think the modern history of Spain will have been much better off. What is really remarkable about the Constitution of 1887 in the United States, and I am a big admirer, and I actually teach this to undergrads for many years, is this wonderful balance between these ideas of creating a modern union and a modern republic, but also with a hard-nosed pragmatism of we need something that will work day to day. Okay, and Madison and everyone else who was involved in the design of the Constitution need to be immensely praised for being able to balance ideals with the practical wisdom. And unfortunately, I think that in the Spanish political tradition, this concept that you need to balance ideals with practical wisdom has always been absent. I think it has a little bit to do with our Catholic cultural background, of the martyr that dies in the pile of fire or against the lions in the circus of Rome, instead of trying to think for something that is practical and is possible. And even the Constitution of 1787 had a few things that didn't quite work out and had to be amended right away. But that shows that constitutional design is very complex because it's very difficult to forecast all the situations that may arise and how to address them.
You did mention in the book that you thought the Constitution of the Second Republic is a lot more clear when it comes to state competences.
Yes, actually, that's fun. That's true. So as much as I was a critic of the Constitution of 1931 in some aspects, it actually designed political structures in terms of decentralization that was much more transparent. It was much shorter. It was less ambiguous. So in that sense, yes. So that part of the 1931 Constitution I like a lot. Now, on the other hand, someone could criticize me for the following thing. The 1931 Constitution really only was in operation for 5 years until the war starts. Even in the area still controlled by the Republicans after the coup d'etat in July. Oh, by the way, today is July 18th. Even after the beginning of the coup d'etat, in the areas still controlled by the Republic, it was not really operative in any meaningful sense of the war. So you only have 5 years, and that means that we don't really know how the system will have ended up 10 years later, 20 years later, 25 years later, and it may be the case that it will have ended up with even a worse outcome. But having said that, I think that the reading of the sections of the articles related with the home rule by regions in 1931 was actually quite a sensible one.
One of the common critiques of your critique of the financing plan for Catalan is this idea that, but shouldn't there be different models of financing for regions? Isn't that competition actually end up being good for the state in general?
So we need to be very careful about distinguishing two different things. Thing number one is, should we have fiscal competition among different regions or territories? Yes, I'm happy with that. The second argument is, should we have asymmetries in the legislation that allows different territories to do that. And that's what I'm against. Okay? So look, Texas can lower taxes and offer a more attractive environment to businesses than California. But the federal legislation applies in the same way to Texas that to California. What I'm against is the idea that you are going to have some rules applying to Catalonia, to the Basque Country, and to Navarra, but not to the rest. What I want to emphasize, and I think this is a point that many of my critics don't get, is that the fact that I want to treat everyone symmetrically doesn't imply that I want to impose uniformity, which is a very different thing. But if we are going to let Catalonia make decisions about this income tax, we need to let everyone else make exactly the same decisions. So if you tell me, I walk into your office, will you sign up the Swiss fiscal system? Probably yes. Will you sign up the US fiscal system? Probably yes. The point is that is not what is being proposed on the table. And I think in a very disingenuous way, people who defend what is being proposed on the table right now are saying, oh, but this looks like Switzerland or the United States. And that's a lie. They are using the prestige of Germany or Switzerland or the United States to defend something that is not the system in Germany, in Switzerland, or in the United States.
But could you make it more concrete? Exactly why isn't it like the Swiss model? Because on the surface, it really seems very close to this model.
In the Swiss model, you have the following. You have a federal revenue service, and you have the cantonal revenue services. Okay? So the federal revenue service is a federal agency that runs the VAT and the federal income tax. And the federal income tax and the VAT is the same for everyone in Switzerland. And that's the money that the federation uses to run the federation. And then every canton has a cantonal income tax. I'm skipping some minor details. I'm aware of them. I'm just trying to simplify so this doesn't look like a lecture in college. And they have their own state, their own local income tax, and you pay to your canton for that amount of money. The canton uses that money for running their businesses. This is most emphatically not what is being proposed right now. What is being proposed is that there will be no national revenue service in Catalonia. 100% of the taxes will be raised by the Catalan revenue agency. VAT, all income tax. And then Catalonia will keep all that tax revenue and just use a little bit of that tax revenue to transfer to the central government as a contribution. You see how it doesn't look at all like the Swiss system. The Swiss system, there is a federal tax system run by a federal agency, and there is a local tax system run by a local tax agency. These guys say, no, in Catalonia, there will be no national tax agency. We will raise 100% of the revenue, and then we will just pass a little bit of a check at the end of the year to the central government. The best way to think about it, this is how the European Union works. Portugal or France, they raise all the revenue, and at the end of the year, they send a check to Brussels. That's basically what they want.
This is one very unique thing about Spain, as you reported that Pedro Luis Uriarte, that the Basque Country way of doing financing is the only way in the world that this is happening.
Yes.
In Basque, how the collection works is they collect the money, as you mentioned, and then they remit 6% to the government, which is obviously now very small. Why was it that this amount was fixed back in, I think, 81 or so? It has never been adjusted since then.
So this is simply politics. It turns out to be the case that the two main parties in Spain, the Socialist and People's Party, the Conservative Party, often do not get a majority in Congress. They only get a plurality. And they need extra votes. And the nationalist Basque countries are always ready to chip in for those extra votes in exchange of keeping the system the way it is now. And in addition to it, we made a mistake in the original design in 1981 that says that the system can only be approved by agreement of both sides, of the central government and the Basque government. So you are in the following situation. I'm, let's say, the Socialist Party. I run for election. I get a majority. And you are the nationalist. I don't need your votes. You just say, I don't agree with any change. The system gets us to stop. 4 years later, I don't get a majority. I only get a plurality. And now I need your 5 MPs. And then you say, Jesus, now is where we are going to talk. You see how the system is absolutely perverse. You always have a veto to make against any change that is against your interest. But you have a lot of power when I need your MPs to get the system to go in my direction. And that's in fact why the system actually has become more and more unjust, because something that has happened is the social security in Spain right now runs a gigantic deficit. And that deficit is being paid by the central government. But in the computation of the contribution that the Basque Country pays to the central government, that deficit of the social security is not included. Which means that they benefit because the pensions, the retirement benefits are still being paid in but the Basque Country, but they don't pay anything whatsoever. And that's why in the book we demonstrate that at this moment, the Basque Country is receiving net transfers from Spain, net fiscal transfer, which is absolutely ridiculous. This will be the equivalent in the United States of Connecticut receiving transfers from Mississippi. That goes against any basic principle of fairness. Even if you were a hardcore libertarian who believes that everyone should run their own affairs, this is even worse than that. This country is not chipping in for the running of the country, it's that they are receiving transfers from the rest of the country. Look, if the Pnv wants, Pedro Sánchez will fall tomorrow. If the Pnv says Spain will have elections, according to the Spanish legislation, you need 55 days between the fall of the government and the election. But if Pnv wants, today is July 18th, it's too late in Spain now, it will need to be done on Monday. So Monday plus 55 days, Spain will have elections. That's just on the hands of the Pnv. That's an enormous power that other small regional parties across the world do not really have.
So on that point, so the reason why that's possible in this case in Spain is because of the Franco-Hispanic coalition that Sánchez had to put together after the last election because they couldn't get seats. But that's going to my question, which is, why is it that the central government is even considering this new Catalan law? Of course, you hint at it in this answer, but could you be more concrete on that?
So the situation is as follows. At this moment, in Spain, every time we have a general election, there are really 2 general elections going on. There is a general election in 15 regions, and then there is a general election in Catalonia and the Basque Country. And we are in a situation with these 2 elections give very different outcomes. So if you take out Catalonia and the Basque Country, the right-wing parties have won the election in Spain every single time, I think since 1996, except I think in 2005 and even 2004, and even then they lost for 1 MP. Both Catalonia and the Basque Country vote so overwhelmingly on the side of nationalist and left-wing parties that completely switches the situation. So this is particularly important for Partido Socialista, for the Socialist Party. The Socialist Party now depends crucially on the MPs that they can elect from Catalonia. This is not very different, for instance, from the Liberal Party in Canada that depends crucially on the MPs that they can elect in Quebec, that they can elect in Western Ontario, or even Labour in England, in the United Kingdom, in most of the elections, not in the last one, but in most of the elections, Labour doesn't have any way towards power that does not pass through getting enormous amount of MPs from Scotland. Which means that at this moment, you don't really want to think about PSC, the Socialist Party in Catalonia. So people miss one point. PSC is literally a different party from the Socialist Party in the rest of Spain. It's a federated party. And the joke I often make now is that it's not that PSC is federated with PSOE, it's that PSOE is federated with PS, which is very different. And that means that the MPs of Catalonia have become so immensely important for Pedro Sánchez and for the future of the Socialist Party that they are willing to give this legislation. Now, the problem, of course, is that the Socialist Party, for instance, in Asturias, in Andalusia, and in Extremadura, understands that this will be the kiss of death. There will be the end their own electoral chances. And that's why I think that what is really going on right now behind closed doors is a civil war within the Socialist Party. What happens for those listeners who are not following day-to-day Spanish politics is last Monday, which I think it was the 14th, there was supposed to be an announcement between the Socialist and Esquerra Republicana, the left-wing nationalists in Catalonia, of the new financial agreement. And what they published, a statement of 3 or 4 pages, is absolutely ambiguous and empty. And the reason for that is because I think that even within the Socialist Party, it's not clear that Pedro Sánchez commands enough majority to support this change of the system. But the Socialist Party is really in a terrible situation for the long run, and basically becoming the party that only exists and only has electoral power in Catalonia and the Basque Country. And it's not very clear to me, once Pedro Sánchez is gone, how they are going to be able to recover their electoral foothold in the rest of Spain.
So one thing you mentioned in the book also is it's summed up in this line where you mention all the people in Asturias believe that Galicia is better financed than Asturias, but all people in Galicia believe Asturias is better financed than Galicia. Why exactly do people have this weird dichotomy views?
So it's very simple. The system right now is extremely obscure. It's very difficult to understand what is going on. And in fact, I will argue it was designed in an obscure way on purpose. And this basically means that it's very easy for politicians to blame all your problems on the system not giving you what you want. You could not imagine how many times I had discussions with people saying, no, the problem of the system is X. And I said, look, X is not true. And I will actually show them the piece of law, the legislation showing them that the X is not true, and they will not believe it. And I will say, well, what do you want me to say? So I think you are in Asturias, and I want to run for president of Asturias. So it's for me to go and say, shit, you are not doing that well. It's not my problem. I don't get enough money because the system. But then I'm doing the same in Galicia, and then you have a twin brother, Rashid Prime, in Galicia. And now I'm saying, Rashid Prime, you are not doing very well. It's because these Asturians are getting a lot of money. Mm-hmm. So it's a very easy political spin to give. And because the system is so extremely complicated, look, if I really wanted to explain the system with you in all this detail, you will need to give me at least 10 hours. And you have a background in economics. Good luck trying to explain this to someone who doesn't have a background in economics and doesn't have 10 hours for me to explain it. And that means that politicians like obscure systems. Politicians do not like transparency. Because if it is transparency, it's very clear that you are the one who have a screw up. If there is obscurity, there is someone else's fault. Everyone loves that. And that's the main problem in Spain right now, that we have designed a system that is so darn complicated. In the book, we say we are not going to name names, but there is this very, very famous journalist who actually recently got a prize to the best journalist in economics in Spain. And he wrote in December this article that was full of inaccuracies. Now, do I think he was lying? No. I just think he didn't understand the system. So even a well-respected senior journalist writing for a very large Spanish media corporation cannot get this right. How is the average voter going to get it right? Think about any relation, any relationship. You are never going to be the one saying, no, it was my fault. You are always going to blame the other person. I have been in this profession for 25 years. I have never seen a case of a paper co-authored by 2 co-authors, and the paper didn't quite work out, and co-author X, it was all my fault. I think that in every single case, the answer I got was, my co-author didn't do what he was supposed to.
Do you think that the financing system of Basque Country and Navarra should be removed?
Oh, totally. I don't know if you saw my X post this morning on July 18th. It needs to be abolished, destroyed, exterminated. And once we have finished with that, we are going to bring a Catholic bishop who is going to do an exorcism of every single code book that ever had any memory of that system and throw holy water. And then we are going to go to Wikipedia and eliminate all references in Wikipedia that system ever existed, and go to every textbook and eliminate every reference in the textbook. Am I clear? what Stalin did to Trotsky memory in the Soviet Union is little in comparison with what I want to do with the cupo.
Wouldn't it be just politically so infeasible of getting rid of that system, given the reforms to the constitution and things like that? This is a tough thing to remove.
That's true. And I'm realistic. I know this is not going to happen on Monday. I learned something from Milton Friedman. You put the ideas on the table. Once you put the ideas on the table, they have their own dynamic. And sometimes life surprises you. If we never put those ideas on the table, nothing will ever happen. So just between you and me and everyone else listening to us, even if just the proposal of removing the cupo means that the next negotiation of the cupo is not as unbiased as before, that will already be a good outcome.
Why did the Spanish government remove and then re-implement a wealth tax within 3 years?
So, two reasons. First, of course, the wealth tax is quite a distortionary tax and is probably not a good way to tax. But the wealth tax has two advantages, one that is good and one that is bad. The good one is that the wealth tax, and this is something that very few people have in our models in economics, is a good way to control and audit income. So in the US, if I get $10 million 5 years ago and I use it to buy some property, after 5 years, when any type of legal liability for those $10 million not paid in income tax will disappear, I don't need to justify anything. If you had a system of wealth tax, it's much easier to keep track of quick changes in wealth that hide changes in unreported income. So I'm actually relatively favorable to idea of a very small wealth tax, only 0.001%, just to be able to keep track of sudden change in wealth that represent hidden income. Now, of course, I know what a lot of people is going to say. You start with a 0.001% and you end up with a 10% tax. The second argument is that in Spain, there is a lot of suspicion. You can check that in any type of survey about values, about wealth. And most people think that wealth is a sign that you have done something nefarious, and that you have stolen, that you have exploited someone. So politically speaking, Spaniards are very favorable to a wealth tax. And even if you try to explain to them that this is, first of all, not a very important source of revenue, and second, that is a highly distortionary, that's a lost battle.
What hidden effects does Asian population have on territorial distribution of public spending in Spain?
The North is aging much more than the South. It means that the North needs many more resources than the South for things like both health and social security retirement. And that basically means that the system needs to be adjusted to control these things. And look, I hear a lot of people saying things like, oh, we should have less transfers and they need to figure it out what to do. And my answer is, look, Galicia cannot figure out what to do. They have already an enormous amount of old people and you need to provide services to them. So you need to consider that. And as Spain ages more and more, this is going to be very important and needs to be a fundamental factor. You need to pay social security, you need to pay health services, and they are not uniformly distributed within the country.
You mentioned, I think, in an article that elections in Spain are won by pension. And given that's the case, then where do you see this idea of doing real reform for long-term planning that, might not have short-term bad effects, but you might think they have short-term bad effects?
Yes.
How does a politician actually get things done?
Oh, I wish I knew the answer to that. I'm actually quite pessimistic. In some sense, I feel like St. John, a voice that claims in the desert. I think that nothing is going to happen with the Feijóo government, and I think that basically no reform of substance is going to happen over the next 4 to 5 years. After what I think is going to happen with, let's say, 60% probability, who knows, the life is so complicated. But the country is going to be in such a terrible fiscal situation that all doors are going to be open. And then who knows how we are going to end up. And I think it's going to be a moment like in 1959 where literally there is no money left. And then even if you don't like to do reforms, you need to do them. So that's my forecast. We are going to kick the ball down 5 more years.
So just for listeners, Feijóo is the leader of the PP party.
What?
There's a lot of surveys that show that the Vox has a plurality of voters under 25.
Yeah.
So unlike the US, where the younger people tend to be more pushing a bit more right-wing, what does that indicate to you?
In fact, I will push that line a little bit further. I think that at this moment it has a plurality in voters under 55.
Wow.
Yeah. In Spain, wages have been stagnated since 2008. And so if you are under 55 and you look at your life cycle in comparison with the life cycle of your parents or even your grandparents, you have been doing worse. The price of housing has completely skyrocketed and the economy is not doing very well. And in a well-defined sense, we can come back to that later on, and we are accumulating a lot of public debt. So I think that a lot of people are basically saying, look, the current system, and in that sense, both the People's Party and the Socialist Party are just offering basically slightly different versions of the same recipe. It's not working for us, so we need to look for something different. And at this moment, the only one who is offering something different, for good or for bad, I'm not judging that, is Vox. And I think that People's Party has made a strategic mistake. They thought that Vox was just a flavor of the month, that it will disappear, and I think they have made a fundamental mistake, and they are going to stay there forever or for the middle run, and it's only going to keep growing. And of course, let's remember, there are 2 boxes in Spain. There is Vox, and there's another one that we call Alianza Catalana. They have a slightly different view about what the nation is, but for all practical purposes, Alianza Catalana and Vox is the same party. I will not be surprised if Alianza Catalana becomes the largest nationalist party in Catalonia in the next 5 years.
Wow. So, final question. What do you hope for the general, let's not go public per se, but let's say the pundit class in Spain? What do you think they should really grasp from the book?
Look at numbers. Spain doesn't believe in numbers. Spain is one of the few countries in the world where a minister under the People's Party criticized the reforms proposed by a friend of mine, Luis Garicano, because he had done them with an Excel file. Her argument, which I think is absolutely, Cospedal was her name, one of those nefarious politicians that we have had in Spain. She actually says that. She actually says, we don't believe in doing policies with an Excel file. We don't believe in numbers in Spain. You have been here for a while and you will realize that Spain is one of the few countries where you can actually brag about the fact that the letters mean science and humanities. And that means that numbers are irrelevant for me. Spain is a country that doesn't believe in numbers. And if I just could get people to say, look, these are the basic numbers of the system, let's talk about numbers, I will be happy.
Jesus, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.